Welcome back to Analyse Asia, a podcast dedicated to dissecting the pulse of technology, business, and media in Asia. Now, I am your host, Carol, and today we have a very special guest who is both an old friend of mine personally and an old friend of the show. And her name is Rui Ma. She is the creator and host of the podcast Techbuzz China by Pandaily, produced by SupChina. So welcome, Rui.
Hi, good to be here. Good to be here, Carol.
So since you've last appeared on the show, what have you been up to?
Yeah, I think that was a while ago. And I think that was, if I remember correctly, was on Neo or something. It was on electric vehicles. That's right. Well, I've been to a lot of things. So I've been deepening my work in China tech. As Carol said, I do have my own podcast called Techbuzz China. We led an invite-only group of public market investors to China last October, and we had a ton of meetings, met with a lot of interesting companies, including the one we're discussing today. And then very recently, we actually also launched a paid newsletter. So it's really for people who are serious tech enthusiasts about China tech and also public market investors. And it's called Techbuzz Extra Buzz.
And we will drop a link for those of you who are interested in checking out both the podcast as well as the newsletter. So Ray mentioned we're going to talk about Bilibili, as you can probably tell from the title of the podcast. And now Bilibili is one of my personal favorite video sites, probably the favorite among all the Chinese options that we have here. And we're going to talk about Bilibili specifically because, and you, Ray, probably also experienced this, a few months back when we were turning the page to the start of the new decade, Bilibili held this New Year's Eve show that blew up. Right, my Wechat was just filled with people sharing different segments of the show and, talking about how great it was. Did you probably experience that too, right?
Yeah. Well, not as much as you because I am a lot older. So my peer group is not as big a fan of Bilibili as probably yours is. But I did see a lot of mentions of the show and how it really was the most popular event of its type for tiding over, for the New Year's Eve events. Yeah,
that's right. I was looking at the stats on their website where you can still view the show. It was live streamed and then later available as just like a video format. It's 3 videos actually. And in total, it gathered about 88.5 million views with 2.9 million like bullet comments, which are these comments that you can see on the screen. And then it had a rating on the Bilibili site of 9.9 given by 78,000 people, which is really high. And even on Douban, which is another site where people usually go to rate all sorts of shows, it had a 9.2 rating versus probably Hunan TV is one of the other most popular destinations to view these type of New Year galas. It only had a rating of 5.4. So you can kind of imagine the difference in popularity and the quality of the show. So let's talk about the origin story of Bilibili. Now, how has it become a platform for fans or for young people who are interested in certain niches, such as, for example, anime in China?
Yeah, sure. So I can give everyone a brief overview. So like Carol said, Bilibili is really started off as a site that was catering towards an audience that was especially interested in anime. And the reason for that is because if you look back a decade plus ago in China, when online video was just starting to come into vogue, this is sort of 2007, 2008. There were a lot of online video sites, your Tudos, Youkus, etc. were all founded around then. But none of them catered to this audience that was specifically interested in anime, manga, sorts of like Japanese cultural shows. And so basically fans of this particular genre had nowhere to go. And what happened was they aggregated together and formed their own site. The first site of this sort that was very popular was actually called AC Fun. And that stands for Anime Comics or AC Fun. That was sort of the first site that was dedicated to this. And actually one of the founders of Bilibili was a very early power user of this site. And for a very long time, Bilibili was actually sort of composed of fans of AC Fun. Their nickname at the time was basically the backyard of AC Fun. But ultimately, AC Fun had a lot of operational issues, and that's basically when the founder of Bilibili, this guy, or really to me, a little kid, because he's only 31 this year, called Xu Yi, came out along with a couple other friends and started Bilibili because they were unhappy with the, quality of the website AC Fun because of various bandwidth issues, et cetera, et cetera.
So let's talk a little bit about the founders of Bilibili, because I think there is an interesting story there as well, right?
So the interesting part about Bilibili is that, she at the time, like I just told you guys, he's only 31 this year. He was very young and he had just graduated college. And actually he was getting involved in all this stuff while he was in school. So he really didn't have any real world experience and didn't have any business sense. He came from like a sort of well-to-do family, but it wasn't like he was so loaded he could fund everything by himself. What happened was, luckily for Bilibili, there was this other older, more experienced person named Chen Rui, spelled R-U-I. And he basically...
Just like your name.
Just like my name, yes. And he was an angel investor at the time. And he is sort of more my age, right? So he's post-80s kid versus he's born in 1989, almost post-90s. And Chen Rui was a hardcore anime fan. And what happened was that he saw Bilibili and he wanted to actually make his own version. Because Bilibili at this point is very young. And he was just like really, really interested in leaving the company he was at and starting also an animation website. And then when he went to his friend who was a much more accomplished entrepreneur, basically said, well, Ray, why do you want to do that? Why don't you just like angel invest instead? Because this is a very high risk proposition. And plus you have a very good job. And it's true. Chen Rui at the time had a very good job. He was part of the original Kingsoft Mafia. I don't know if everyone's familiar, but basically out of that mafia or out of that company was birthed, Lei Jun and subsequently Xiaomi and a bunch of other related companies. Chen Rui had a really, great career going for him. He had this overwhelming love for animation. He decided to go and seek out the founders of Bilibili. He took his friend's advice. So instead of making a competitor on his own on the side, he angel invested. And he basically stuck with the company and was really, really instrumental in getting Bilibili scaled up. And at one point, he actually quit his job and decided to join full time and is now the CEO of the company. And basically, I think like for most of the industry, everyone believes that if Chen Rui didn't join, Bilibili probably would have suffered the same fate as AC Fun. AC Fun, very unfortunately, even though it was the first one and it had a lot of traction, had a lot of fans, and it had a lot of really interesting innovations, including that bullet screen thing that you talked about earlier, the bullet comments. It just wasn't able to survive because it didn't get the right sort of business guidance and didn't get, funding in time, etc. So Chen Rui, with his expertise and his background and his connections in the startup world, was really able to prop up Bilibili to the business it is today.
So talking about the business of Bilibili, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about their monetization models, maybe?
Yeah, of course I can. So a lot of times Bilibili, actually, if you go visit with the management and if you read their presentations, they'll try to compare themselves to YouTube. But if you think about YouTube and YouTube being a primarily advertising-driven platform, that's actually not how Bilibili works. So Bilibili is still a company that is actually not dependent on advertising much at all. What it is right now is that it's about 50% revenue from gaming. And that was a sort of accident when they discovered that one of the popular games that was actually inspired by a comic, a biographic novel. So it's very much in tune with the same audience, that consume Bilibili content. They decided to license the game and become the exclusive distributor in China. That game was called Fate Grand Order. That happened to be just one of the best-selling games ever for that genre. And so even today, 4 years later, it still makes up about 50% of Bilibili's revenues. And if you're curious how much that is, well, that's about $130 million per quarter. So Bilibili is still making quite a bit of money from that game and a few other games, but still primarily from that game. And then as for the rest of the sort of 50%, half of that, so about 25% of their revenues is coming from live broadcasting and value-added services. And then the remaining is split between advertising and e-commerce. So unlike, YouTube, which it compares itself to a lot, it's actually like I've just said, about only 1/8 coming from advertising, its revenues. When it went public, though, what's really interesting is that when Bilibili went public a year and a half ago, it was actually primarily deriving its revenues from gaming. The management has done a lot to diversify its revenue streams so that it is not so reliant on gaming, and especially not on that one franchise alone. And we see a lot of effort of the business to, make more money off of what we would think is sort of maybe more natural for a content business. So the broadcasting, advertising, and then also monetizing its audience through e-commerce. So anime and similar branded products.
You talked a lot about their efforts in gaming or esports, and I know that they've vamped up their efforts since 2016 as well to go into other games. Can we talk a little bit about that? How much have they really done in this space, other than the game that you've mentioned?
So aside from the, New Year's Gala that they were in the news for that we talked about at the beginning of the show, another thing that they were also, in the headlines for was buying the exclusive rights to distribute the League of Legends championships in China. And they spent a lot of money on this, so over $100 million for the rights for the next few years. This is something that a lot of people were surprised by, not necessarily because, that they spent so much money on these rights. Esports is huge in China, right? We're talking about over half of the audience globally is in China. But it's the fact that, Bilibili was able to win against the several other publicly listed esports dedicated companies like Huya, Douyu, etc. So they are definitely making a lot of moves in this area. And I think, Carol, you can probably add more on some of the other things they've done, like buying of teams, etc.
That's right. So in 2017, they purchased a League of Legends team that was called IM, and now it has been renamed to Bilibili Gaming. And Bilibili Gaming has been competing since the season 8 of the League of Legends World Championship, but unfortunately they haven't really placed yet. And then also the next year in 2018, they also purchased a team in the Overwatch League, and that's another really popular game, although not as popular as League of Legends. And they are also taking part, so that Overwatch team is also taking part in the 2019 seasons. So they have bought their own teams to compete, and as well as, acquiring the rights to distribute like you talked about.
Maybe we can just mention really briefly here that one of the main reasons why they bought the championships was because last year over 100 million people watched League of Legends championships, including a peak of over 44 million concurrent viewers.
And for those of you who are not as familiar with esports and who might know a bit more about football, well, the Super Bowl in 2020 drew an audience of about 102 million. So the audience size is pretty comparable, and you can get a sense of the actual popularity of the championship in Asia and around the world. And Ray, you mentioned YouTube earlier when you're talking about the monetization model for Bilibili. Are there any other major differences or similarities that you see between Bilibili and YouTube in the US? Because YouTube is really the most popular video site in North America and around the world, whereas here in China, we have quite a few options. Other than Bilibili, there's still Youku, there's still iQIYI as well.
I think one of the reasons why, Bilibili itself likes to compare itself to YouTube, several really good reasons, right? So yeah, you mentioned iQIYI, Youku, etc., but they're really known more for their professional content. And so while Bilibili is also known for having a lot of shows that they've licensed and bought the rights to, including all the anime, etc. What's unique about it is that it also is a place where a lot of user-generated content resides, especially some of the most creative, I would say memeable, viral content on the internet for Chinese users. So in that sense, Bilibili really has probably one of the most concentrated communities of creatives making video content. And I would call it a semi-professional content because a lot of the content is several minutes long. They require a lot more editing. For example, there's this whole category, which is basically like auto-tuned videos that are actually pretty complex to edit. So they're different from, let's say the 15-second short videos you see on a TikTok or something. So a lot of analysts will actually call these types of videos sort of professional user-generated content. And Bilibili has a really high concentration of this type of creatives. And it's basically, I would say, the source for where a lot of these videos make their way into the consciousness of, the Chinese internet users. I don't know how to say this like elegantly, but basically it's a source of a lot of memes.
Agreed. And I think you really hit something that's core to why people go on Bilibili. It's because of all the original content that you really can't find anywhere else. Just like how, because of the rise of content creators on YouTube, the word YouTuber became a thing, right? That is a profession. You can become a YouTuber and can aspire to become a YouTuber. And in China, for Bilibili, if you upload onto Bilibili, then you're called an upzhu, which literally means like uploader. And that term is specifically used to only refer to those who upload onto Bilibili, because that's where most of the original content came from. And we mentioned just a little bit about the bullet comments. Would you like to maybe just explain it just a little bit more to our audience? Because it's not really a feature that is available on YouTube. So our audience might not necessarily be so familiar with what we call 弹幕 in Chinese.
Basically, like we were saying earlier, the founding team Bilibili were originally really involved at AC Fun, and actually AC Fun copied this 弹幕, this bullet chat, bullet screen, whatever you want to translate it as, from a Japanese website called Nico Nico, which actually still exists today and is doing really well. It's like a top 10 website in Japan. But basically, the way the bullet chat works is very simple. So it's basically an overlay of your comments. So instead of in YouTube, where all the user comments are below the video, you can basically have your comments show up on top of the video at the time of the video that you want it to coincide with.
Yeah, and I think that makes it very, very interesting, because it might be like an hour-long content and your comment specifically only applies to maybe like 1 minute and 30, right there. Whereas in the YouTube comments, people will actually have to specifically cite a reference to a frame of time in the video. Whereas if you're watching Bilibili, people's comments is just going to show up whenever they want to show up. And that really adds to the viewing experience. And I know that a lot of people actually watch certain shows or certain videos to enjoy the comments on top of the video. So that's like an added on experience, And now all the other Chinese websites have also copied this feature.
Yeah, it's pretty entertaining. It makes it a lot more interactive, basically, because it feels like you're watching the video with a bunch of other people.
That's right. It's almost like you have a bunch of online friends who you're watching it with, and they provide really funny comments. And Bilibili also actually releases the most popular phrases that come up in these bullet comments on a yearly basis. And for the year 2019, the phrase or the key word is an acronym. It's AWSL. Do you know what that stands for, Ray? Or do you know what that means? AWSL.
Yeah, and it means what's right?
Yes, it does. And can you tell the non-Chinese speaking listeners, what does that mean? The phrase what's
It just basically means this slays me.
That's right. It's like when we say, "Oh, I'm dead."
I'm
That's
dead,
right,
but like
I'm dead, because it's so funny or it's so overwhelming in some way that you're like overwhelmed with emotions. Oh, I'm dead. It's literally I died. It's hilarious. And a lot of other lingos are generated from Bilibili as well, and then spread to the wider popular culture or the wider society, like you mentioned. I think another really interesting and fun aspect of Bilibili is the registration process to be on the site. I know it's slightly different from some of the other social media sites such as Facebook and Wechat. So can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so most social networks or video websites or whatever, like whichever website we generally talk about, they're always trying to simplify, right, the registration process because they want as many users as possible. We're always trying to, make the onboarding process very simple. Bilibili, because of the way it started, it was really this very sort of self-identified community of anime nerds. They really wanted to protect the people that come into their community and considered it, it was a very close-knit community. So in order to sort of filter out people that they didn't think would fit, they basically had this very, very difficult, almost like an entrance exam that you had to pass in order to be let in as a member. That exam still exists today. It's considerably less difficult, but it's still 100 questions. You you need to pass 60. You basically need to answer 60 of them correctly in order to become sort of a full member. And I would say, yeah, like the questions are pretty difficult. I was able to pass it on my first try, but it took me probably an hour and a half. And I did a lot of Googling because the questions are highly specific, right? We're talking about like asking you what is the song that's playing on a certain, season finale of a certain show that they think, many of the users would have watched. So it's very specific things like that.
Wow, that does sound very difficult. So you basically had like an open book exam where you had to take the time to fill it out.
Yeah, pretty much, because there's no way. I mean, you could choose categories, right? So yeah, I picked tech and entertainment. So some of the tech ones I knew, but even the tech ones had really random trivia, like, like who invented this? What was the year this software was released or something like that, right? So some of them, I mean, it is multiple choice. It's not fill in, so it's not the hardest thing. But given that, most registration processes, as we were saying earlier, try to be like as simple as possible. This is the most complex thing I've ever had to do in order to basically, view some funny videos.
Yeah, it's like Jeopardy, but for nerds kind of thing. That's pretty funny. I know that Bilibili has done some interesting partnerships. For example, the New Year's Eve Gala that we talked about actually was a partnership with Xinhua News Agency. What are some of the other partnerships that they have done and that you found interesting?
Well, first of all, I think that's really worth noting just because Xinhua is a state-owned media and it's like really like the farthest thing that you could think of from the sort of alternative, really hip, really like cool kids that are on Bilibili, really, creative, right? Another thing as well, just like Xinhua, right? Like the state-owned media, CCTV, they launched an official account. CCTV, for example, launched an official account on Bilibili, which I also thought was interesting. That's not quite a partnership, but they did it with sort of this like, not quite cool, but they did try to do it in a rap style to, I think, appeal to the users of Bilibili. Other cooperations that I think are maybe more expected would be Tesla, right? Tesla now is going to be, just announced that they're going to be installing Bilibili in all their vehicles. So you would be able to, it's going to come as a default app, I believe, is the partnership. So yeah, if you order a Cybertruck, it will be available. You can watch Bilibili in your Cybertruck. So, and then I think another major one is Bilibili and Taobao. Basically, they announced, so actually Alibaba invested in Bilibili. Bilibili is one of the few companies that have both Alibaba and Tencent as investors. One of the things that they announced recently was that Bilibili and Taobao will have this partnership where Bilibili creators can sort of, create merchandise and sell them on Taobao. Like I said earlier, when we're talking about the monetization model of Bilibili, that's already showing up, right? E-commerce is now something like 12-13% of the total revenues. I think in large part to the collaboration with Taobao and the efforts they've made to try to make money off of the merchandise of some of these creative efforts from their users.
And do you think this Bilibili model, where it's a video site but not too reliant on advertising, but instead have multiple revenue streams, if that model can be exported to other countries like the US, India, or Southeast Asia, or are there already examples of similar models out there?
Well, I think it depends really on what you think its model primarily is, right? So if you just strictly look at it where it's making money, then it looks like half of a gaming company. And clearly there are many, many gaming companies that do well and make money, right? But if you think of Bilibili as sort of this community where there are young people and who are very creative, making original content and uploading it, and then now we're starting to see them also monetize it through live streaming and e-commerce, etc., then that's something that actually I would argue we see other companies do as well, like, the short video companies. I would not say that Bilibili has a unique model that cannot be replicated elsewhere. I think what is unique about it, though, is basically how loyal and how dedicated its user base has been throughout all these years, right? So earlier, like we had mentioned that Chen Rui came in and really scaled up the company. But even after he came in, the company didn't make money for a very long time. I mean, it had like a fraction of the revenues it had now just 5-6 years ago before it stumbled upon gaming. So it really built up so much goodwill with its users that its users were very patiently awaiting for it to come up with a business strategy. And I think that's actually pretty rare. I think a lot of the headlines I remember seeing a couple years ago was that if, for example, Bilibili ever ran into financial trouble, its users were like more than happy to like donate to make sure its operations ran, because they were just so dedicated. They just felt identified so much with this community that they wanted to make sure it continued to exist and be successful. And I think that's something that, again, that also can be replicated, but that's actually the hardest part. And I think that's the heart of Bilibili.
That kind of loyalty, that level of loyalty is definitely very hard to duplicate or to cultivate, I think. So, Ray, do you watch anything on Bilibili, or do you have anyone that you follow on Bilibili?
Basically, I would say no, actually. So I would say for me, honestly, I'm almost 40. I am on Bilibili for researching stuff. And most of the time I encounter Bilibili content, honestly, is through other websites like Wechat articles or whatever. That's basically talking about this or that meme. And then when I click through, I'll often see that some of the most interesting content that I encounter are actually hosted on Bilibili and made by a Bilibili upju. So that's basically my interaction with it. I work with university students in a nonprofit, and I do know Bilibili is much more popular with them, and that they do use it a lot. So I am not part of the target audience of Bilibili, though.
Understood. Like I said earlier, the Bilibili is my favorite site out of all of the video sites that exist in China. So that is my go-to site unless something is exclusively available on another site. And I actually have friends who are upju, or who are they post stuff on Bilibili, and some of them actually have a significant amount of following. Is there anything else that you would like to add
about the company? Well, I would say Bilibili, I think the one notable thing I think about the company is that even though earlier, we had said about how its users have been really patient and are very loyal, I do sense some tension coming up. So because the company has been around for such a long time, over 10 years, in many, you could say right now it's doing very well, but in some ways, right, like half of the revenue is still coming from gaming. People are still like, well, that's not really what you're necessarily known for, on the internet. How do you better monetize like what you're actually sort of well known for, right? And I think the Bilibili has been sort of slow and deliberate about that process. But as of last year, Chen Rui has actually really come out and said that we're going to speed up as a company. We're a publicly listed entity. We've been around a while. We're actually going to really focus on growth now. So far, I haven't seen them do anything that has pissed off their users in their efforts to monetize. But I would be less surprised now that they've openly said that they're going to focus on growth more if they do something that might be, that might basically piss off their users.
Right. And I would like to also add that, we've all heard of people who make their career out of YouTube, or they make a living from YouTube. But honestly, I haven't really heard this type of success stories with people who upload onto Bilibili. People who are big on Bilibili, often they divert their traffic to other sites like Weibo or like Taobao or other places where then they can monetize. And so I do think monetization is something that it's a problem that they need to solve eventually. All right, so that is the end of our conversation on Bilibili. And if you want to learn more about the topic, that Techbuzz China has also done an episode in the past, so be sure to check them out. And before I let you go, Ray, is there anything that you want to recommend to our audience that has inspired you recently or lately?
I recently just finished, and I highly recommend the book Range by Jeffrey Epstein, which talks about how having a multidisciplinary approach and basically being diversified in multiple subject matters actually help you come upon more innovative and creative ideas. That was actually a bestseller last year, and I finally read it. I thought it was really good.
That sounds really interesting. Last but not least, how can my audience find you?
Easiest way to find me is on Twitter. My handle is RUIMA. Or else you can also find me on our website, or you can also go to our website and find us. We just launched a website. It's called Techbuzz China, all one word.com.
And you can find us on Twitter as well at Analyse Asia. That is Analyse with an S. And you can find my personal handle on the Analyse Asia Twitter page as well. And for more episodes of Analyse Asia, we are available on all podcast platforms, iTunes Podcast, SoundCloud, on all of the podcast platforms where podcasts are played. And see you next time. Bye-bye. And thank you so much for coming, Ray.
Awesome. Thanks.